Hi, my name is Zach Huffman with Pocket Coach Academy, and in partnership with UIL, we're going to be teaching you a little bit about policy debate, kind of its foundations, what it's about, and a little bit of the structure of policy debate, or as you'll see it labeled in UIL a lot of times, CX for cross-examination debate. So, what is policy debate? It's a competitive, research-based debate format where you have two teams of two, and they argue for or against a specific policy proposal by the U.S. government. So, for example, it might be that the United States federal government should strengthen its immigration policies, or the United States government should increase it or decrease its arms sales. Um, and I've already slipped my mind of what last year's topic was, but I know that this year's topic is going to be exploration and development of the Arctic. So basically, teams will argue whether or not the United States government should do that. So the affirmative team would obviously support them adopting that policy, while the negative team would argue against that policy. And this is a really good activity in order to increase students' public speaking abilities, their argumentation skills, their critical thinking, and it's going to help them a lot in their other academic endeavors, whether that be school or other extracurricular activities. I know for myself, debate really helped me in my English classes because it taught me how to speak better, which in turn also taught me how to write better. So it helped a lot with my academics, and I'm sure other debaters would say the exact same. So, a couple of benefits, and there's statistics behind what I just said. It does help with your academics. For example, debaters tend to maintain a GPA of around 3.23, which is a little bit higher, about zero point 0.4 points higher than what the average non-debater would get, which is a 2.38. And to be honest, that includes students who might not participate a ton in debate. So I think if you were looking at students who spent a lot of time doing debate, their GPA would probably be a little bit higher than just that 3.23. I mean, I know in my experience, the people that were going to every tournament with me, were practicing every day with me. I know that they all were 4.0 students. And I think that um, debate attracts those students, but it also helps build those students. I mean, you're not going to have a ton of, below 2.0 students eager to join speech and debate. But if they were, then their GPA would boost. And if they are 4.0 kids, I think that debate is going to help them not only keep that 4.0, but also increase their scores like ACT and SAT. For example, as we have standardized test gains here in the ACT, debaters are plus 15% in reading and English, plus 10% in math, and a huge 27% boost in science. That's going to happen with a lot of the research that we do in debate. I can see why that would increase science scores in SAT, 52 plus in math, plus 57 in reading and writing, which is a 115-point total increase, about 7.5%. These are huge increases that you're seeing just from students participating in debate, and that just kind of leads into their other academic endeavors like standardized testing or their GPA. It's directly linked to improved academic performance, which is why so many colleges are looking for students that did debate, not only for their own debate teams that happen in college, but also just because they know that those students are good students. So let's talk about the structure of a policy debate round. So, like we said, each round is two teams of two. You have the affirmative team supporting the resolution, negative team opposing the resolution. Each student is going to give two speeches, and each student is going to ask a CX, is going to be the question asker in a CX period. And then they're going to be receiving questions as well. So everybody gives two speeches, everybody has to ask questions, and everybody has to answer questions. Um, so yeah, each team is going to give four speeches, two constructive speeches, two rebuttal speeches. Each debater is going to give one constructive speech and one rebuttal speech. So, in terms of the speech order, let's start with the constructive speeches. So, the constructive speeches are where students are going to be building up their case and kind of constructing the arguments that they're then going to argue about in the rebuttals. So, the 1AC is called the first affirmative constructive. It's 8 minutes long. This is where the Affirmative team is going to present their plan, the case around that plan, which is going to include things like advantages and how they solve their harms, which we'll get more into what those terms mean into a separate video. Um, and cross-examination then happens. So after the 1AC is finished, it's an 8-minute long speech. You have a 3-minute cross-examination period, or as a lot of people you'll hear call it, just CX. So that CX period is going to be 3 minutes. A good way to remember whose CX period it is, you are never going to, if you are about to speak, then you are not going to be the one asking questions. So after the 1AC is the 1NC. And the 1NC is going to be, still preparing a lot of the speech during this CX period, and won't have time to prepare questions, which is why the 2N, who is going to give the 2NC, is going to be asking or cross-examining the 1A or the 1AC, and that lasts 3 minutes. And usually, in CX of the 1AC, the negative team is looking to just try to clarify exactly what the plan does, and that will allow them to figure out better ways to attack. It's also a good spot to get affirmative teams in a hole if there are contradictions in their 1AC. Cross-examination is a great place to make them kind of resolve those contradictions. So after that CH period is the 1NC, the first negative constructive, and this is where the negative is going to introduce all the major arguments against the affirmative. That includes off-case and on-case positions, disadvantages, counterplans, topicality, violation, and critiques, along with direct responses to the case itself, which would be the on-case arguments. Once again, we'll get more into what those specific arguments are in a separate video. We're really just focused on the structure right now. So after the 1NC, that 8-minute long speech, you're going to have another CX period. So remember what I said, if you are about to give a speech, you are not going to be the one that's cross-examining the last speech. So the 2AC comes after the 1NC, which means that the 2AC will not be the one asking the questions, which means the 1A or the 1AC is going to be asking the questions on the 1NC. So the person who presented the 1AC and spoke is going to be asking the questions for the 1NC. And very similar, mostly just asking some clarification questions, what exactly the negative is arguing. And then if you have time, get a little bit more into maybe some argumentation, have them resolve or explain some contradictions, and maybe get them into a corner. So after that CH period is the 2AC, the second affirmative constructive. That's going to last 8 minutes. And this is personally, a lot of people will say it's the 1AR, but I personally think the 2AC is the most important affirmative speech. It's where you're kind of presenting all of the arguments that are going to be available to you after the 1NC. So really, a 1AR or 2AR, which we'll get onto in a second, but other affirmative speeches kind of all have to base themselves on the 2AC. And if the 2AC isn't able to answer all of the arguments introduced by the 1NC, then they're dropped arguments. And that means that the negative team is going to be able to extend those without any pushback, which basically means if the 2AC doesn't answer the negative team's argument or any one of their arguments, then that argument is now considered true to the judge, which is why the 2AC is so important. And it's so important that they spend their time wisely. They allocate their time wisely to specific arguments. That way, they aren't undercovering really important arguments. So just like every other constructive, after the 2AC, you have CX of the 2A. And if you're following the rule, this means that the 1NC would be CXing the 2AC, since the 2NC is going to be speaking in a moment. This is where you're going to poke holes in the responses. Once again, a very important CX period. I think this is where the negative team can really start to poke holes in what the affirmative is doing, because the 2AC is where you're going to get the responses to the 1NC arguments, which then allow the negative team to critique those responses during the CX period. So after that CX period, you have the 2NC, which is the final constructive, the second negative constructive. This is going to be an interesting speech because it's almost combined with the 1NR in a lot of ways. But this is where the negative is going to respond to the 2AC, continue their attack. And the 2NC is usually going to choose only a handful of arguments to expand and develop, whereas the 1NR will take some of the other arguments. And this is called splitting the block, where the 2NC will typically take the I like to call it the A strategy. The main arguments that the negative thinks they're going to win on and eventually extend in the final rebuttals, whereas the 1 in R is going to take some of the lesser important negative arguments, maybe some arguments that you're just not going to see as necessarily round winners at the end, even though they might still help. So I'm thinking of things like case defense, maybe a topicality violation would usually go into the 1 in R, whereas the 2 in C is going to be taking some more important positions that more directly attack the affirmative case. And just like every other constructive, we have the final CX period where the 2A is going to CX the 2 in, and very similar, is just going to try to poke holes in some of those responses. So after we have the constructive speeches, we get the rebuttal speeches. These are where the rounds are won or lost because this is where you are condensing down your arguments and flushing them out in the final way for the judge's adjudication. So with the rebuttals, we start with the negative team actually, which is an interesting dynamic. Typically, you would think that it would go affirmative, negative. Not in this event. In this event, we give both teams, both AF and negative, they both get a specific advantage. So the affirmative team, they get to speak first and they get to speak last. They get the first speech and they get the last speech. Whereas the negative, they get the block, the negative block, which we just kind of talked about when we were talking about the 2 in C. But the negative block is basically 13 minutes of negative speeches with a 3 minute questioning period in the middle. And the negative gets to just extend so much stuff and put so much pressure on the 1 AR. So the 1 NR, like I talked about, is usually the second half of a team splitting the block. They're going to cover the remaining arguments not handled by the 2 NC, which finishes the negative block. And it's called a block because it's two speeches in a row blocked together. Where no other speeches are like that. It's just the 2 NC and the 1 NR that happen pretty much together, where they're working in tandem to create almost one big speech, which is what makes this next speech so difficult. So a lot of people like to say the 1 AR is the most difficult speech in the debate. I still think it's the 2 AC, but the 1 AR is definitely up there. All these rebuttals are going to be 5 minutes long. I don't know if I mentioned that, but and there's no CX periods with these rebuttals. But the first affirmative rebuttal is where you have to make sure that you are covering every argument more than necessarily explaining every argument. So think about it. The negative block happened, and there's 13 minutes of negative arguments that just got thrown at you. And then the 1 AR has 5 minutes to respond to all of them, which is why it's such a time pressured speech, which is why you shouldn't be spending a ton of your time in the 1 AR, going in depth on these arguments, whereas you should be spending your time just making sure you get the arguments out kind of bare bones, just enough to where the 2 AR is able to expand on it if they need those arguments to win the round. So the 1 AR is pretty difficult in that sense because it forces the 1A to condense, pick and choose specific arguments that they think are more important than others, make maybe strategic drops, and just make sure that they get to every part of the debate. So after the 1 AR, we have the 2 NR. This is going to be the last speech by the negative team. This is where they're going to explain to the judge why they think they won the debate. The 2 NR is typically going to condense or collapse. And what that means is there are going to be tons of arguments that the negative reads. Maybe they read 5 off-case positions and 3 on-case arguments, but realistically, only one of those arguments is going to be the AF killer. Only one of those arguments is going to win the round. And it's usually better if you can go in depth on the one argument that you think is the strongest. So, for example, a negative team might read 2 disads, a counterplan, and a topicality violation, but they might decide that the counterplan and one of the disads are the strongest arguments that they have. So instead of talking about the T violation and that other disadvantage, the negative team is going to spend the entire 2 NR going in depth on why they won the debate because of the counterplan and the disadvantage. So that's called condensing, where the negative team kind of condenses down to their strongest arguments, and that's what they use to win the debate. Because at the end of the day, the negative isn't worried about answering the affirmatives responses to some of those other off case positions, like that other T, that T shell or that other disadvantage, unless that there's specific offense on it, which we'll get more in depth on in another video. But the negative team isn't as worried about covering everything. They're not worried about extending all of their arguments because they're more focused on just condensing their strongest arguments into this 2 and R and winning on that. And that's the best negative strategy to have. So finally, we have the 2AR, the very last speech in the debate. Um, this is where the 2AR has to take the arguments that were extended in the 1AR and turn them into a winning speech. So the 1AR, remember, if we use our example, two disads, a counterplan, and T, the 1AR had to answer all of those. The 1AR had to put answers on T, they had to put answers on the disad, the counterplan, and the other disad. Whereas the 2 and R didn't even touch the topicality page or the other disadvantage page because they don't have to worry about answering everything or extending everything. They just have to win one argument that proves that the affirmative is a bad idea. Um, so the 2 and R is able to condense down to that, and then the 2AR has to use just the little bit that the 1AR touched on that counterplan and that disad. Just whatever they had in that 1AR, the 2AR has to turn into a winning speech. So typically judges are going to be pretty lax, like if a negative team really condenses and kind of pressures you a lot time-wise in the 1AR, judges a lot of the time will have some grace for the 2AR to expand on those things a little bit more, which helps the affirmative win. So maybe the 1AR didn't go into super in depth on the solvency questions on the counterplan, but they mentioned it, right? That allows the 2AR to kind of bring that up and then go into a little bit more depth, which would help, you know, contest that counterplan. So the 2AR is 5 minutes where the 2A is really focused on just crystallizing all of the affirmative arguments. And ensuring that the 2 and R's, really pointed, narrow attack doesn't work. Um, so that 2AR is really, really difficult. I wouldn't say it's harder than the 1AR or the 2AC, but the affirmative team usually has a little bit more of a difficult time in debates because negative teams have a lot more flexibility. They have a lot more time to prepare against the affirmative case because usually teams know what your case is before they even get to the tournament. So they have a lot of time to prepare against it. Whereas AF teams have no idea most of the time what the negative team is going to read. And some of these speeches are just a little bit more difficult than the negative side. Like the 1AR, the 2AR, and the 2AC, I think are all more difficult than the 2NC, the 1NR, or the 1NC. Now, the 2NR is pretty difficult. But um, these last couple of rebuttals are really, really, really important. And this is where roles start to get defined amongst your debaters. If you're coaching a team, typically you're not going to have a debater that it's just flip-flopping every round between, maybe one round they're the 1A, the next round they're the 2A. That's usually not the case because different debaters have different skills. If you have a kid who's really, really fast at reading, then you probably want them to be in the 1AR. And if you have a kid who's really, really polished speaker and is a really good debate, like round vision mind, then you probably want them to be in that 2NR or that 2AR spot. So don't think that a good debater necessarily needs to be good at all of the speeches. I would see if you can figure out which students specialize in which areas, which will then help you choose if they need to be a 1A, a 2A, a 1N, or a 2N. So that's why the specific purposes of these speeches are so important, so you know what your best chances of winning are. So next time we'll get into more of this. Whenever we talk more about specific argument types and everything, we'll get way more in depth on this. It looks like a lot. Don't worry about it. Not that much. Um, but yeah, so this has been the Pocket Coach Academy, kind of just little explanation, introduction into what policy debate is or CX debate is. It's really beneficial. Everybody loves it. And I would argue it's probably the most rigorous debate event that we have. And UIL puts a lot of emphasis on it.